There's an interesting verse in the middle of Psalm chapter 78, verse 41. Again and again they tempted God and limited the Holy One of Israel. How do you limit God? This chapter is not attributed to David, but to Asaph. And in the opening verses, verses 1 through 7 or so, he really kind of sets the tone for the message. He wants to be sure that the nation reminds the younger generation of all that God has done and all that God has said, and that process continues generation after generation. But again, the question remains, how do you limit God? And he gives us several things in this chapter that are indicative of how one could limit God then, actually how one could limit God now. In verse 9 and 10 and 11, the children of Ephraim, being armed and carrying bows, turned back in the day of battle. They did not keep the covenant of God. They refused to walk in his law and forgot his works and his wonders that he'd shown them. Well, among other things, what he classifies in this passage, this part of this chapter, here are people that were disobedient, had responsibility, really didn't take that responsibility as seriously as they should have. Because of that, they didn't keep the covenant. They refused to walk in his law. Disobedient. Now, I know that's what you may say, but that's not what I'm going to do. How often is that the case today? I know God says this, but I don't think that applies to me. Even if the context shows that it does, I'm going to conclude that it doesn't. I'm going to do something different. Individuals that will be disobedient because they put their will ahead of God's. Let's go down to verse 17, 18, and 19. They sinned even more against him by rebelling against the Most High in the wilderness. They tested God in their heart by asking for the food of their fancy. Yes, they spoke against God and said, can God prepare a table in the wilderness? Can God really provide food? But it's not just that question. The statement in verse 18, they tested God in their heart by asking for the food of their fancy. Can God give me what I want? This is what I want, and I'm going to pray fervently about it, and God's going to give it to me because he gives us the things for which we ask. It's something that I want rather than what does he say. So in this situation, you've got individuals that are demanding of their own desires. How do people limit God? Well, they limit God by being disobedient. That's kind of a generic term, encompasses a lot. But here, they limit God by demanding their own desires rather than accepting the blessings as God provides them. Let's go from verse 19 over a little bit later on to verse 32. In spite of this, they still sinned and did not believe in his wondrous works. And what he's mentioned are so many things that he did by bringing that nation out of captive bondage in Egypt to a land where he is guiding them and providing what they need, and they don't like it. They clamor for going back to Egypt for all the produce that was theirs to enjoy even as slaves. So that in spite of all that God did for them, they still sinned and did not believe in his wondrous works. It's like, okay, you saw the miracles against those false gods of Egypt. You've even seen the way that God provided manna for you, the way that God even provided birds for you to eat. God has provided much for you. God's provided water for you to drink. It's like they're dismissive of that. Maybe that was just circumstance. Maybe it just happened at the time that Moses was calling upon God. Can we really say that there was something that Yahweh did or something that just happened to coincide with those pleas and those prayers? They did not believe in his wondrous works. They're dismissive. Verse 36 and verse 37. They flattered God with their mouth, and they lied to him with their tongue, for their heart was not steadfast with him, nor were they faithful to his covenant. They're hypocritical. They're saying one thing but believing something else. They're saying one thing, doing something else. They're not who they claim to be. How do you limit God? In each of these ways, you're limiting God. Down in verse number 40 and 41. They often provoked him in the wilderness and grieved him in the desert. And then verse 41, they limited the Holy One of Israel. The verse following that, verse 42, they did not remember his power the day when he redeemed them from the enemy. He worked his signs in Egypt, his wonders in the field of Zoan. They turned the rivers into blood. The streams of the Egyptians they could not drink. All of those things, verse 42, they did not remember his power. How do you limit God? You forget everything that he's done. You forget those things in the past. You forget those things that are actually almost present. Current blessings that you have, you dismiss. But you forget anything and everything that God has done for you. Verses 56 through 58, they tested and provoked the Most High God and did not keep his testimonies, but turned their back and acted unfaithfully like their fathers. Unfaithful, but it doesn't stop there. Verse 58, they provoked him to anger with their high places and moved him to jealousy with their carved images. Put other things in place of God. You think, well, we don't do that. We don't worship idols today. You can make anything into an idol in the place of God. It could be a boat. It could be an RV. It could be your job. It could be a hobby. Nothing wrong with any of those things as long as God comes first. But with these individuals, with this nation, that was not the way that it was. So the statement that's made in verse 41, again and again, they tempted God and limited the Holy One of Israel, is enumerated in multiple ways in this chapter in which they actually did that. Let's go back and look at the statement that's made earlier in this chapter, verse number 8. And this kind of sums up everything. May this new generation not be like their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation that did not set its heart aright and whose spirit was not faithful to God. That really kind of says it all. Is it possible to limit God in your life? You bet it is. It was then. It is now. But whether or not we're faithful to God depends not upon God, but upon us. Whether or not we look into his word and examine it and try to analyze it in any way, in every way we possibly can to make sure that it's correct, that's on us. He's provided us this message. He's provided this sacrifice through his Son, our Savior. He's given us so much. But with all of that, we can be dismissive. We can be unfaithful. We can be hypocritical. We can be forgetful. We can actually become idolatrous. We can flatter him with our mouth and live a lie. May that never happen to those who are his children. Interesting chapter. A lot of warnings involved in this chapter. May we never succumb to any of those characteristics that are enumerated by Asaph in this chapter in Psalms. Please stay safe. We'll talk again soon.